On a golden July morning in 2001, a spirited 24-year-old hiker stepped into the heart of the Montana wilderness, a place where towering pines scrape the skies and hidden ravines swallow sound. Her name was Elira Dane, a recent environmental science graduate who lived for the call of wild places. That morning she promised her mother a simple hike to clear her head before job interviews began, just a quick loop to Shadow Ridge. By dusk she was supposed to be home for dinner. She never returned. Her old Jeep was discovered at the trailhead, unlocked, a half-full bottle of water still resting in the passenger seat. Footprints on the trail marked her progress, an apple core lay discarded near mile 3, and then there was nothing. What really happened to Elira Dane that summer day in 2001? Why did her trail vanish into silence, leaving only questions that haunted her mother for over 2 decades? If you wish to uncover these answers, like this video and subscribe to my channel Unscripted Tales. Let us reach 5K likes so that this story of wilderness secrets may continue. I also want to know from which corner of the world you are watching this story, so share it in the comments below. Elira was known across her small town as a free spirit with an unshakable love for the outdoors. With sun-touched hair tied back in a loose ponytail and a battered backpack filled with trail mix, a map, and her journal, she was the very embodiment of Montana's hiking culture. That July morning, her mother, Mara Dane, stood on the porch of their cabin outside Hamilton, watching Elira drive off down the dusty road. The sight of her daughter's Jeep disappearing into the pines was supposed to be routine, but it became the last memory of her setting out alive. When evening came and the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks without a sign of Elira, Mara's worry ignited into panic. By nightfall she was on the phone with the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office, her voice steady but tight with fear. A search began at dawn. Elira's Jeep sat untouched at the trailhead, offering no clues. Helicopters swept overhead, rangers and volunteers scoured the ridge, and search dogs strained at their leads as they called her name through the trees. Her footprints carried investigators 2 miles up, but they ended abruptly near the fork where the trail split. It was as if she had vanished into the wilderness itself. For days, the forest echoed with voices and the thrum of helicopters, but no further trace appeared. Theories took root. Some whispered of a sudden bear attack though no blood or tracks were found, others feared she had fallen into one of the hidden chasms. Darker voices speculated foul play. News crews arrived, headlines declared young hiker vanishes in Montana wilds, and the mystery captured the nation's attention. Mara appeared on television, holding her daughter's photo close, insisting she would not give up until Elira was found. But as weeks passed, volunteers drifted home, and the official search scaled back. Hope began to wither beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Elira's case was quietly marked as probable misadventure, another soul lost to the immensity of Montana's untamed land. For Mara Dane, it was not a closed chapter but the beginning of a lifelong vigil, a grief sharpened by silence and a story without an ending. The weeks after the disappearance of Elira Dane stretched into months, and the months into years. For her mother, Mara, time stopped on that July evening in 2001. While the rest of the world moved forward, Mara remained frozen in the moment her daughter's footsteps vanished into the forest. Every summer she lit candles in front of Elira's photograph, turning the anniversaries into vigils where neighbors gathered, speaking softly about the girl who once hiked with so much joy. Mara's home slowly transformed into something more than a house. Maps of the Bitterroot Mountains covered the walls, marked with red pins that tracked every lead, every rumor, every faint whisper that someone might have seen her daughter. She spent her savings on private investigators and scoured online forums that promised sightings of missing hikers. Each time the reports collapsed under scrutiny, but Mara refused to give up. Hope was her only fuel, even when it left her exhausted and alone. Over the years, stories swirled around the community. Some claimed Elira had chosen to disappear, that she had walked into the wild to escape her pain. Others suggested she had battled depression after the loss of a relationship and that perhaps she had ended her own life in the quiet embrace of the mountains. Mara rejected these ideas with every fiber of her being. She knew her daughter's spirit. She knew Elira loved the wilderness not as a place to surrender to sorrow but as a place to heal and dream. Seasons changed, yet the ache remained. Mara grew older, her hair turning silver, her body slowing with age, but her determination hardened like stone. She could not let go. The trail where Elira vanished became sacred ground, a place Mara returned to with worn boots and tired eyes, calling her daughter's name even when the forest answered only with silence. Decades passed, and grief settled into her like a permanent shadow. The world beyond Hamilton moved on to new stories, new tragedies, and new headlines, but Elira Dane remained tethered to the wilderness that had stolen her only child. What she could not know was that beneath the soil and among the trees, the mountains still held the evidence that would one day shatter the silence and reveal the truth. Something was waiting deep in those woods, a clue that would surface when the time was right. For 23 years the mountains remained silent, holding tight to their secret. Then, in the spring of 2024, the silence cracked. A trail maintenance crew, clearing storm debris from a remote gully far off the marked paths, stumbled upon something half buried beneath a fallen log. It was a weathered backpack, its fabric torn and faded, but still intact enough to carry a name stitched into the lining. It belonged to Elira Dane. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and time. Her journal lay within, pages warped and smudged but still legible. The final entry was dated July 12, 2001. It read with haunting simplicity, "The ridge calls, peace at last." Alongside the journal, tucked in a side pocket, was an object that did not belong to her. A small rusted pocket knife, its handle engraved with the initials TWW. The knife became the spark that reignited a case the world had almost forgotten. Forensic experts examined the items with modern technology unavailable in 2001. On the backpack, faint traces of blood were found, barely visible but enough to create a partial profile. It matched Elira. The confirmation was both relief and devastation for Elira Dane. At last, there was proof her daughter had been injured. Attention turned quickly to the knife. Its engraving was not random. Investigators traced the work to a local blacksmith in Hamilton who had crafted similar designs decades earlier. The initials pointed toward a man whose name had never been spoken during the original search, a former park ranger named Thorne Whitaker. Thorne had patrolled the Bitterroot National Forest in 2001, yet records suggested he had never been interviewed at the time of Elira's disappearance. That omission now looked less like oversight and more like a shadow hiding something deeper. The discovery of the backpack and the knife breathed life into the cold case, setting in motion questions that could no longer be ignored. Why had Thorne Whitaker's name remained absent from the investigation, and what truth was buried beneath the silence he had kept for over 2 decades? Detective Silas Crow carried the rusted pocketknife into the quiet cabin of Thorne Whitaker, a man now in his late 60s whose eyes had grown as weathered as the pines outside his window. The detective placed the knife on the table between them. Its engraving glinted in the dim light like an accusation. When asked about it, Thorne's hands trembled and his gaze slid away. At first, he muttered that he had never seen it before, but the silence that followed weighed too heavily for lies to stand. Pressed by the detective, Thorne's defenses cracked. His words spilled out slowly, each one dragged from the depths of guilt he had buried for 23 years. He confessed that on the day Elira Dane vanished, he had been on patrol along Shadow Ridge, binoculars in hand. From his high vantage point, he saw her moving along the trail, stopping to admire the view. Then, from the trees, another figure emerged. It was his younger brother, Vance Whitaker, a troubled man with a history of violence and a reputation for drifting between crime and addiction. Thorne described how the scene unfolded below him. He watched as Vance confronted Elira, voices raised in anger. When she tried to walk away, Vance struck her hard, sending her to the ground. Thorne froze, unable to move, his mind paralyzed by shock and fear. He admitted that by the time he made his way down the ridge, both his brother and Elira were gone, swallowed by the forest. For years, Thorne carried the weight of what he had seen, silencing himself to protect his job, his reputation, and the fragile thread of family loyalty. His confession revealed what Mara Dane had feared all along: her daughter had not been lost to an accident or to the wilderness itself, but to violence. Thorne's silence had hidden the truth, and in doing so made him complicit in the crime. As his words echoed through the cabin, Detective Crow understood that this was no longer just the story of a disappearance. It was the story of betrayal, of a brother shielding another, and of a witness who chose fear over justice. But what had become of Elira's body, and what evidence still waited to be uncovered in the shadowed depths of the Bitterroot Forest? Guided by Thorne Whitaker's reluctant confession, search teams turned their attention to the rough gully where Elira's backpack had first been discovered. It was an unforgiving stretch of land, thick with underbrush and scattered boulders that seemed untouched since the day she vanished. Ranger units moved with precision, their dogs weaving through the trees, noses pressed to the earth. Hours passed until one dog froze, its body tense, paws scraping at a mound of moss-covered stones. Beneath those stones, time had hidden a secret for over 2 decades. As investigators carefully pulled away the layers of rock, fragments of bone came into view. The forest grew still as the truth of Elira's fate was unearthed. Forensic teams worked with delicate hands, gathering the skeletal remains and placing them gently into protective bags. At last, Elira Dane had been found. The bones told a story of violence. The skull carried fractures, the ribs showed breaks, and the pathologist's conclusion was clear. Elira had died from blunt force trauma, struck down with force, not felled by accident or misadventure. The knife recovered from her backpack was examined once more, and under modern technology, microscopic traces of blood confirmed what Thorne's words had already suggested. The knife recovered from her backpack was examined once more, and under modern technology, microscopic traces of blood confirmed what Thorne's words had already suggested. The knife had been linked directly to Vance Whitaker. But justice had slipped away long before. Vance had died from an overdose in 2010, leaving his crimes buried with him. What remained was Thorne's silence, his years of shielding the truth while a mother suffered without answers. He was taken into custody and charged with obstruction, his once respected ranger legacy stripped away under the weight of his guilt. Mara Dane received the news in the quiet hours of the morning. After 23 years of searching, she now faced the heartbreak of certainty. Yet even with Elira's remains recovered, the forest still whispered of unanswered questions. What had drawn her daughter off the trail and into the gully where danger waited in the shadows? When Elira's remains were finally returned to Hamilton, the small town gathered to honor the young woman whose disappearance had haunted them for more than 2 decades. On a quiet afternoon, a simple funeral was held beneath the same mountains that had once swallowed her trail. Friends, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the case lined the pews, their faces softened with sorrow. Candles flickered as Elira's photograph rested at the front, her bright smile a painful contrast to the grief that filled the room. Mara Dane sat in the front row, her hands clutching the worn locket her daughter had once carried. For 23 years she had lived with the torment of not knowing, clinging to hope even as doubt shadowed her every step. Now she faced the finality of truth. It was devastating, yet there was also a strange kind of release. The endless vigil had ended. No more nights spent wondering if her daughter was lost in the wilderness, waiting for rescue. Elira was at peace, and that knowledge, though painful, freed Mara from the weight of uncertainty. The community mourned beside her, but they also stood in admiration of the woman who had never stopped searching. Out of her grief, Mara began to build something lasting. She established a foundation in Elira's name, dedicated to wilderness safety and education. Its purpose was clear: to equip young hikers with knowledge, resources, and gear so that no other family would suffer the silence she had endured. What began as a mother's personal tragedy grew into a movement of protection and awareness. At the graveside, as the final words were spoken and flowers were laid upon the fresh earth, Mara whispered to her daughter. She had found her after all these years, and though her heart ached with loss, she promised that Elira's legacy would live on in every life that foundation would protect. But even as the mourners departed and the town returned to its routine, the wilderness still held pieces of the story that had not yet been told. The mountains had given back Elira, yet they were not finished revealing the secrets buried within their shadowed ridges. Even after the funeral ended and the town laid Elira to rest, the investigation did not close its eyes. Detective Silas Crow and Ranger Cale Draven believed that the wilderness still guarded more pieces of her story, fragments that could explain the unanswered questions. Why had Elira left the main trail? What had truly drawn her into that gully? The team returned to the ridge where Thorne admitted to watching the attack. While scanning the area, they discovered a weathered cigarette butt pressed into the soil near a rock outcrop. Records showed that Vance Whitaker favored the same brand. That single detail was enough to confirm his presence. Soon after, searchers widened their sweep and stumbled upon a collapsed lean-to deep within the trees. Inside lay the scattered remains of a squatter's life, a rusted tin can, a torn sleeping bag, and a crumpled map marked with rough X's. It was Vance's hideout. The discoveries grew darker. A hidden pit beneath a limestone overhang revealed a stash of illegal traps, bundles of stolen ginseng roots, and a battered ledger. Its entries traced a network of poaching and secret deals. And on the final page, dated the summer of 2001, the words "problem solved" appeared like a chilling echo of Elira's disappearance. Forensics tied Vance to the site through hair samples and fingerprints. Among the evidence, investigators found something that cut straight through the heart of Elira Dane. Half buried in the dirt near the cache was a broken locket, its chain snapped. Inside was a faded photo of Elira as a child and a lock of her hair. Mara recognized it instantly. Her daughter must have carried it for luck that day, only to have it ripped from her in her struggle. The evidence revealed what Mara had long believed. Elira had not gone quietly. The torn fabric of her jacket and traces of blood suggested that she fought with all her strength, resisting until the very end. It was not a stumble into danger. She had crossed paths with Vance's hidden crimes and confronted him, her sense of justice as fierce as the mountains themselves. Mara clutched the locket when it was returned to her, tears streaming as she whispered that her daughter had been brave, even in her final moments. But as investigators pieced together the timeline, they uncovered one final clue that carried the weight of a confession long hidden in the shadows. The discoveries in the ridge and the gully shook the small town of Hamilton to its core. What had once been only whispered theories was now carved into fact. Elira Dane had not wandered carelessly into danger. She had stood against it, and she had paid with her life. Her courage and her tragedy became the heartbeat of a community that refused to forget her. Memorial hikes were organized along the trails she once loved. Groups of hikers walked together, carrying candles and flowers, stopping at the overlooks where she had sketched in her journal. Each step was both tribute and warning, a reminder that the mountains held beauty but also shadow. Vigils lit the nights in Hamilton, where candles flickered against the dark and Elira's name was spoken like a vow. The foundation Mara created in her daughter's honor began to grow beyond her imagination. Donations poured in from across the state, then across the country. With those funds, wilderness safety programs were built, equipping young hikers with survival tools, training, and knowledge. Rangers installed new warning signs at trailheads, urging caution and awareness, determined that no other family would endure what Mara had endured. Yet even as the community found purpose in protecting others, the wilderness remained unchanged. Its peaks still glowed gold at sunset, its ravines still swallowed sound. It was a land that could inspire wonder or demand sacrifice. Elira's story became part of that duality, a legend told to hikers and travelers as both inspiration and caution. She was remembered not as a victim alone, but as a woman who loved the land too deeply to turn away from injustice. For Mara, the legacy of her daughter became her final mission. With every workshop funded, with every young hiker prepared for the trails, she saw Elira's spirit carried forward. The mountains had taken her only child, but they could not silence her story. That story had become a light, shining even in the darkest corners of the Bitterroot. But just when it seemed the truth was complete, the wilderness revealed one last piece of Elira's journey, hidden in the soil and waiting to be found. After 23 long years, the case of Elira Dane was finally closed. What had once been a mystery whispered in every corner of Hamilton now stood as a completed story, a puzzle whose missing pieces had been uncovered one by one. The wilderness that had guarded its silence for decades had finally yielded its secrets, exposing the violence, the guilt, and the courage that had been buried beneath moss and stone. Elira's name was cleared of every rumor, her spirit remembered not as someone who vanished carelessly, but as a young woman who faced danger and fought until the end. For Mara Dane, the answers brought a mixture of heartbreak and peace. She could finally rest knowing what had happened to her daughter, and she could finally speak of Elira's life without being crushed by the weight of uncertainty. The Bitterroot Mountains stood unchanged, their ridges rising into the sky as they always had. Yet to those who knew this story, every peak, every ravine, and every shadow now carried new meaning. They were no longer only landscapes of beauty, but places that held the memory of a young hiker whose final steps had changed a community forever. It was a reminder that behind every ridge there may be a hidden story, behind every trail a truth waiting to be uncovered. Elira Dane's story is now told not in silence, but in the voices of those who walk the trails with her memory guiding their steps. If you are still watching this story, it means it deserves your like and your subscribe. Please help me complete 5,000 likes on this story because this is a challenge from my mother, and I know you can make it possible. It is totally free. And tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this story. For more stories that uncover the hidden truths of the wild and the human heart, subscribe to Unscripted Tales.